Let's start with a very layman's definition of what UX and UI is, because I'm in no way a UX or UI professional, but I do create systems that users interact with, and I've noticed a lot of types of functions of tools that can have a tendency to create barriers to the user having the experience that you would want them to have, and or create barriers to the user providing the information that you want them to. So the user providing the information that you want them to, or the user extracting the utility that you as the creator hope to deliver, is the user interface part of UI. In that, if the system isn't designed in such a way that the user by default provides the information that you want or gets the utility that you want out of the application, then the user interface has failed. The user experience, the UX part, is that while the user is extracting the utility or providing the information that you want, they should not be getting angry at the system or application. So sometimes you're creating an application that you legitimately want people to enjoy, and so that's certainly its own aspect of UX, is making something that's enjoyable to use. But for utility purposes, we're basically looking at making it not unenjoyable to use. For the UI, you want to create an interface where the user is getting either what they want if you're providing something to the user, or the user is providing what you want if the user is presenting information to you. A good interface provides all the inputs and all the outputs for both parties to be completely satisfied. So the UI can have the potential to present barriers to the user getting what they want, or it can present barriers to the creator getting what they want. The UX is how the user experiences that interface. The UX has the potential to introduce barriers that prevent the user from using the application at all. So if the experience isn't right for the user, then the interface just doesn't matter, because you reduce the probability that the user interacts with the interface to begin with. The iPod Classic is the perfect example of a good UX and UI. The UI of the iPod, the scrolling click wheel, center click button, and scrolling click wheel having the 4 directional options, and then the graphical display, that was your entire interface. In the case of the iPod, the creator was delivering utility to the user, and there was no missed opportunity to extract utility with this interface. You had play, pause, skip track, go back, all at your fingertips, as well as the ability to dive into menus, adjust the volume, whatever you needed. The UX of this product was the packaging. It was handheld, had a hold switch on top to lock out the controls of the interface. It fits in your pocket, it's got a backlit display, or full color depending on the generation. The user experience of the iPod was what you did after you interfaced with it. So that's the elevator pitch of my extremely layman's definition of UX and UI. So why is it that I think you can learn it in Excel? Or if we're to continue under the assumption that you can learn it in Excel, what does that look like? Well, if you're using a spreadsheet as a sort of dashboard to provide information to a user, then you as the creator are hoping to provide utility to the user. And you need to not introduce any barriers to the user extracting the utility that they expect from the dashboard. So this means displaying the outputs as clearly as possible and displaying the output data as succinctly as possible, not muddying the output data for the user. It also means delineating the inputs to the maximum extent possible. And then this applies too if you're using the spreadsheet to collect data. You want to break down any logic or critical thinking needed for the input. And you want to reduce the possibility that someone misinterprets the desired input having an effect on the output. So you want to strip out all subjectivity from the inputs. That way the user can only explicitly give the application the information needed to give useful outputs. Bad inputs on the UI introduce the opportunity to fail at delivering the utility that the user is looking for. So the purpose of this short video is not to say what to do and what not to do in UX or UI, or exactly how to learn it from Excel, but rather why exactly it's a good platform to learn on. So this was sort of an MVP for a calculator that I wanted to construct. And you can see that when I first started out, I really struggled with the layout and the placement of the inputs and the outputs. It made a lot of sense as I was trying to get the information out of my head, but on the actual screen and in the way that the user would interact with it, it did not make a ton of sense. So I typically start out my interfaces sketching them on paper, and that's like the first step of getting the idea out of my head and down onto something tangible. But Excel works as sort of the next step after sketching something out on paper, where you can actually click and drag inputs around. And then, so this eventually became this web application. And so it's a very simple tool, and there's nothing special about the spreadsheet itself in terms of what's being accomplished with functions. But the process of actually trying to figure out how to lay out these inputs and outputs was extremely easy to experiment with within Excel. And I was able to end up with this finished product. Another example is this spreadsheet right here. And so I'm using a slider, and I'm using radio buttons and a checkbox to deactivate this input, and that switches the inputs used for this final output to this over here. And this is just sort of a pi calculation and line length calculation that multiplies things and adds things up. And you have the option to either directly input information here or check this box which says to use the linear inches helper, where you can input more segmented data. And it calculates a total for you and uses that for the output. So this spreadsheet is a little bit on the fancy side, but that's not really the point. The point is that the decision to use sliders, how to move the increments, decisions to use radio buttons, how and why I used this checkbox, how and why I broke this information up, and how I spelled out the outputs best for the user to understand. These were all decisions that had to be made with UX and UI goals in mind. And the fact that I was doing this in an Excel spreadsheet was not an excuse to make it look lousy or make it frustrating to use. The point of this is that I could hone those decision-making skills on these spreadsheets so that I could take something as simple as Excel and turn it into at least what I think is something with a pretty decent user experience. One last example of this, and kind of the flip side of what we've been talking about, because the last two spreadsheets were definitely dashboards or calculators where the user was actually extracting utility from the spreadsheet. This one is not so much a dashboard, it's more of a form for collecting information. And so in this case, I was not so concerned about displaying information in a way that was enjoyable for the user, although that's still a good thing to do. What I really wanted to do here was make it as effortless as possible for the user to input the information that we needed. So that means using drop-downs as much as possible. I did a similar thing here where I used a radio button to gray out a box. So it can either automatically populate data based on a decision here, or you can manually input information, minimizing the possibility of misentering information. And again, using drop-downs, in this drop-down I have an other option, which gives you the ability to input your own data. And if you choose one of the other options in the drop-down, it grays out this input box. And then the button at the bottom, all nice and easy for the user to run down through and input information. And it reduces as much as possible the possibility of misinputting data, and it definitely extracts absolutely everything that is needed from the user. So then the final thought here is just that if you use Excel to build widgets and calculators and dashboards and interfaces, and you do it with the user in mind, then you have the opportunity to pick up on a lot of UX and UI principles that can either be applied to building other applications in different formats, or it can just be applied to making better spreadsheets. But all in all, they get you more and more accustomed to thinking about how the user interacts with the application, with the interface, and what experience the user has as they're using it, and allows you to build tools with better UX and better UI overall.